3:15 in the morning on the 28th of March, 2026, the Norwegian Sea. Two Tupolev 160 Blackjack strategic bombers banked heavily into a launch heading. They were 400 miles south of their usual patrol box, and their internal rotary launchers were already cycling. This was not a routine exercise. The flight path was an aggressive penetration of the outer identification zone, and the bombers were running with their transponders dark. The Arctic air outside the pressurized cockpits was minus 55 degrees, a frozen void smelling of thin ozone and the distant, cold salt of the North Atlantic. Below the fuselage of the lead aircraft, the mission computer synchronized the final targeting coordinates for a salvo of 16 Kh-101 cruise missiles. The first missile dropped from the bay at 3:16 in the morning. It fell into the dead air for 2 seconds before its turbofan engine ignited with a jagged streak of white fire. Then another followed, then 6 more. Within 3 minutes, 16 stealth-coated projectiles were skimming the wave tops at a speed of 800 kilometers per hour. They were programmed for a low-altitude, terrain-following flight path that would take them across the North Sea and directly into the heart of Germany. Their objective was a single point on the map: Ramstein Air Base, the critical logistics hub for the United States Air Force in Europe. The eye in the sky. 22,000 miles above the Earth, a satellite of the space-based infrared system caught the thermal bloom. The sensor, designed to detect the intense heat of rocket motors, flagged the 16 distinct heat signatures instantly. The data was processed in milliseconds and beamed down to the Buckley Space Force Base in Colorado. From there, the flash precedence message surged across the Atlantic through secure fiber optic cables, arriving at the 61st Air Expeditionary Wing and the United States European Command in Stuttgart. The launch had occurred at coordinates 68 degrees north, 0 degrees east. The trajectory was unmistakable. The projected time of arrival for the first wave was exactly 110 minutes. For the radar operators at the Combined Air Operations Center in Uedom, the world had just shifted from a state of uneasy peace to the opening seconds of a high-intensity conflict. The silence of the night shift was shattered by the rhythmic, piercing wail of the Integrated Attack Warning System, Scramble at Lakenheath. While the missiles were still over the open water of the North Sea, the response was already in motion. At Royal Air Force Lakenheath in the United Kingdom, the pilots of the 48th Fighter Wing were running toward their aircraft. 4 F-35 Alpha Lightning fighters were authorized for immediate takeoff. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney Phone 135 engines tore through the damp English air, which smelled of wet grass and burnt jet fuel. The lead pilot, call sign Maverick 11, cycled his AN/SPY-6 radar into active search mode as he cleared the runway. His mission was to intercept the cruise missiles before they crossed the Dutch coastline. But the KH-101 is a difficult target. It is designed with a radar cross-section no larger than a bird and flies at altitudes of less than 60 meters. To the sophisticated sensors of the F-35, the missiles were tiny, flickering ghosts lost in the clutter of the sea waves. The defensive perimeter. By 3:45 in the morning, the situation had escalated. The United States Navy destroyer USS Arleigh Burke, patrolling the North Sea, attempted to establish a track on the incoming salvo. The ship's Aegis combat system identified 4 of the 16 targets, but they were moving in a complex zigzag pattern designed to bypass known radar installations. The commander of the Arleigh Burke authorized the launch of 2 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, but the intercept was unsuccessful, as the cruise missiles executed a pre-programmed low-altitude maneuver, vanishing back into the radar shadows of the heavy sea swells. At Ramstein Air Base, the transition to battle footing was total. The base commander ordered the immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel to hardened shelters. On the flight line, maintenance crews worked with frantic precision to move C-17 Globemaster transport planes into reinforced hangars. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust from tow tractors and the sharp, metallic tang of cold winter wind. The base's primary defense rested with the 5th Battalion, 7th Air Defense Artillery Regiment. Their Patriot, MIM, 104 missile batteries were already powered up, their phased array radars scanning the northern horizon. The soldiers in the engagement control station watched the digital maps, waiting for the targets to clear the high ground of the Eifel Mountains. They had 60 minutes remaining before the first impact. The tension was a physical weight. Every sailor, airman, and soldier knew that the 16 missiles in the air represented only the first wave. The Tu-160 bombers were already turning back toward their bases in Russia to reload, leaving a trail of fire behind them that was heading straight for the most important American base in Europe. The question was no longer if the base would be hit, but how much of it would be left standing when the sun rose. 4 in the morning on the 28th of March, 2026, Ramstein Air Base, Germany. The base was no longer a logistics hub. It had become a fortress under siege. The giant voice mass notification system wailed across the flight line, a steady, oscillating tone that signaled an imminent inbound threat. Thousands of personnel, from senior officers to junior airmen, moved with practiced urgency toward the reinforced concrete bunkers scattered across the 3,000-acre installation. The air in the Rhineland-Palatinate Valley was biting and damp, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding forests and the heavy, chemical odor of idling jet engines. On the north side of the runway, the 5th Battalion, 7th Air Defense Artillery Regiment was fully integrated into the Integrated Air and Missile Defense Network. The heart of the defense was the ANMPQ-65 radar station. Its phased array face was tilted toward the north, pulsing out electromagnetic energy to scan the horizon for the incoming KH-101 cruise missiles. Inside the darkened engagement control station, the tactical fire control assistant watched as the blue icons of friendly aircraft began to clear the airspace, leaving only the unknown red tracks hurtling toward them at 850 kilometers per hour. The shield activates. By 4:10 in the morning, the first wave of Russian missiles was less than 150 kilometers away. They were hugging the terrain, flying through the river valleys of central Germany to mask their approach from long-range radar. To counter this, a United States Air Force E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control system aircraft orbiting at 30,000 feet over Belgium provided look-down capability. The E-3 operators relayed high-fidelity tracking data via Link 16 directly to the Patriot batteries at Ramstein. The commander of the 5th Battalion authorized the transition to automated engagement for the outer tier of the defense. 4 Patriot MIM 104 launchers, each loaded with 16 PAC-3 interceptors, swiveled toward the north-northeast. These interceptors were hit-to-kill vehicles, designed to destroy an incoming missile by the sheer force of kinetic impact rather than a blast fragmentation warhead. The soldiers monitored the cooling systems and power levels, their breaths visible in the chilled air of the command van. Air support from Spangdahlem. 50 miles to the northwest, the 52nd Fighter Wing at Spangdahlem Air Base had already launched 8 F-16 Fighting Falcons. These aircraft were equipped with AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles. The pilots pushed their engines into afterburner, the white-hot plumes of light cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as they climbed to an intercept altitude of 15,000 feet. The flight lead, call sign Viper 11, looked down at his glass cockpit display. The ANAPG-83 radar was struggling to maintain a lock on the cruise missiles against the heavy ground clutter of the German hills. Center. Viper 11. I have 2 paints. At latitude 50 degrees north, longitude 7 degrees east, he reported over the secure radio, requesting permission to engage targets of opportunity. The response from the Air Operations Center was immediate. Viper 11, you are weapons free. Defend the hub. At 4:25 in the morning, the first 2 KH-101 missiles crossed the Mosel River. They were now less than 5 minutes from the Ramstein perimeter. The missiles were flying so low that residents in the small villages below could hear the high-pitched whine of the parent, small turbofan engines and see the faint glow of the exhaust. The missiles adjusted their flight path, climbing slightly to clear the final ridgeline, before diving back down toward the base's fuel storage farm and the primary runway. Inside the Ramstein bunkers, the silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of ventilation systems and the distant, muffled roar of the F-16 fighters overhead. Security forces in armored Humvees took up positions around the flight line, their M240 machine guns pointed at the sky, though they knew their weapons were a last, desperate resort against a supersonic cruise missile. The Patriot radar achieved a solid track-via-missile lock on the lead projectile at a range of 40 kilometers. The engagement computer calculated the intercept point. On the launcher, the canister doors were already open. The air was charged with static and the smell of ozone. At exactly 4:27 in the morning, the first PAC-3 interceptor ignited. The rocket motor produced a different, deafening crack that shook the ground for miles, launching the interceptor into the night sky on a pillar of orange flame. The battle for the most vital airbase in Europe had begun in earnest. 4:28 in the morning. Inside the 60-meter deep bunker of the Air Operations Center at Ramstein, the tactical air picture on the main display was a chaotic web of flickering blue and red icons, each representing a life-or-death variable, in a high-speed digital chess match. 16 Russian Kh-101 cruise missiles were threading the needle between the dense urban centers and rolling hills of the German Rhineland, using the terrain to mask their radar signature. The air in the command center was stale and cool, smelling of ozone, recycled oxygen, and the bitter tang of overbrewed coffee. Every eye was fixed on the synchronized data feeds coming from the E-3 Charlie Hawkeye orbiting over the North Sea, and the ground-based sensors of the Integrated Air and Missile Defense System. Track 4412 is maneuvering, the senior air defense officer shouted, over the low hum of computer cooling fans. It just dropped below 50 meters. We lost the active lock from the Spangdahlem radar. The commander of the 61st Air Expeditionary Wing stood behind the glass-walled balcony, his hands gripped tightly on the railing. He knew that the Kh-101 was not just a missile. It was a low-observable stealth platform, equipped with an onboard computer that used a digital map of the Earth to navigate with surgical precision. It was designed to find the gaps in the Western defense net, and this morning, it was doing exactly that. The digital battle, the tension in the bunker, was a physical presence. A heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic tapping of keyboards and the urgent, low-volume radio chatter from the interceptors in the sky. To the north, the 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons from the 52nd Fighter Wing were flying at the edge of their performance envelopes. They were attempting to dive into the clutter of the hills to find the missiles, but at 800 kilometers per hour, the margin for error was measured in centimeters. At 4:32 in the morning, the AOC received a high-priority data burst from a German Air Force radar station near Koblenz. 2 of the missiles had been spotted, crossing the Rhine River at coordinates 50 degrees 21 minutes north, 7 degrees 35 minutes east. They were moving at a speed of 820 kilometers per hour, flying barely high enough to clear the tops of the industrial cranes lining the riverbanks. The information was instantly processed and pushed to the Patriot batteries at Ramstein. "We have a confirmed track," the tactical director announced, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his system. Adjusting the engagement basket for Battery Bravo. Time to impact is now. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The staff watched as the red icons turned toward the base. The missiles were no longer zigzagging. They had entered their terminal attack phase, climbing slightly to gain altitude before their final, high-speed dive onto their pre-programmed targets. The final line of defense. Outside the bunker, the world was a study in high-contrast darkness and artificial light. The sprawling airbase was nearly dark, with only the dim blue taxiway lights and the occasional sweep of a security vehicle's headlights visible. The wind had picked up, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and the distant, mechanical scream of the Patriot radar's cooling systems. The soldiers of the 5th Battalion, 7th Air Defense Artillery Regiment, were now the only thing standing between the Russian salvo and the heart of the American presence in Germany. The AN/MPQ-65 radar had transitioned from search mode to a high PRF track, a concentrated beam of energy that illuminated the lead missile like a spotlight in a dark room. The engagement control station's computer system flashed a ready-to-fire notification. The first interceptor had already been launched, a spear of flame that was currently 5 miles away and closing the distance at 3 times the speed of sound. Inside the command center, the countdown reached the 2-minute mark. The mission was no longer about strategy or diplomacy. It was about the cold, hard physics of interception. The staff held their breath as the 2 tracks, the red missile and the blue interceptor, converged on the digital map. The impact point was less than 12 kilometers from the base's northern perimeter. If the Patriot failed, the base's secondary defenses, the close-in weapon systems, would have less than 10 seconds to react before the first warhead detonated. The room was silent, the only sound the steady, heart-like pulse of the radar sweep. 4:30 in the morning. The northern perimeter of Ramstein Air Base. The darkness of the Rhineland night was suddenly obliterated by a vertical pillar of white-hot light. The first Patriot PAC-3 interceptor shrieked off its launcher, the solid rocket motor, punching a hole through the damp air with a roar that shattered windows in the nearby village of Landstuhl. The heat from the launch washed across the concrete pad, smelling of burnt polymer and intense chemical propellant. 2 seconds later, a second interceptor followed, its guidance fins twitching as it locked onto the terminal telemetry provided by the ANSPY-6 radar. High above, the sky was a lattice of orange fire and white smoke trails, a violent geometry carved into the blackness. The first Russian Kh-101 cruise missile was less than 8 kilometers out, diving at a shallow angle of 20 degrees. It deployed its final countermeasure package, releasing a cloud of radar-opaque chaff to confuse the incoming interceptors. The first Patriot missile was baited by the decoys and detonated prematurely, a brilliant flash of light, 4,000 feet in the air, that did nothing to stop the steel-tipped threat below. The second interceptor adjusted its course, its onboard seeker head screaming for a lock as the closure rate exceeded 3,000 kilometers per hour. The climax. First contact. The trigger was squeezed in the digital heart of the engagement control station. The second Patriot interceptor slammed into the tail section of the cruise missile, but the impact was not a clean kill. The kinetic energy tore away the missile's guidance fins and shredded its engine. But the 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead remained intact. The crippled projectile, now a tumbling mass of jagged steel and burning fuel, skipped off the atmospheric cushion and slammed directly into the roof of Maintenance Hangar 3. The warhead punched clean through the reinforced aluminum and steel rafters, detonating 6 feet above the concrete floor. The blast wave expanded at 7,000 meters per second, instantly vaporizing 2 C-13J Super Hercules transport planes parked inside. The hangar's massive steel doors, weighing several tons each, were blown outward like sheets of paper, tumbling across the taxiway and crushing a parked security vehicle. A fireball 300 feet wide erupted through the roof, bleaching the sky white and casting long, dancing shadows across the entire flight line. The heat was so intense, it melted the plexiglass windows of the nearby control tower, and the pressure wave compressed the chests of every airman within a half-mile radius. The base did not descend into chaos. It transitioned into a desperate, high-speed recovery. The immediate aftermath was marked by the deafening, rhythmic clang of the mass casualty alarm. From the hardened shelters, the 78th Fire and Emergency Services flight surged forward. 6 P-19. Airport rescue fire trucks raced toward the inferno, their sirens a lonely, high-pitched scream against the roar of the burning hangar. The firefighters, clad in silver heat-reflective suits, deployed massive water cannons to contain the secondary explosions as thousands of gallons of high-octane jet fuel began to ignite in the drainage systems. On the flight line, security forces in armored Humvees swerved around, burning debris, their tires melting on the scorching tarmac. All stations, This is base command. Hangar 3 is a total loss. Defensive batteries, stay on target. The second wave is still inbound. The voice over the radio was tight, strained by the physical shock of the blast. Medical teams with stretchers moved toward the perimeter of the heat zone, their boots crunching on shattered glass and fragments of shredded aircraft skin. They were working in a landscape of black smoke and orange fire, the air thick with the acrid stink of burnt rubber, and something far worse. Immediate aftermath. Thick, oily, black smoke boiled out of the wreckage of Hangar 3, rising 1,000 feet into the air and blotting out the stars. The silence that followed the initial explosion was filled with the hiss of automated sprinklers and the distant, metallic groans of the hangar's collapsing skeleton. The first blow had landed. The United States had taken a direct hit on its most vital European soil, and the smell of ozone and death hung heavy over the runway. But even as the fires raged, the Patriot radars to the north continued to pulse, their beams searching the darkness for the next set of red icons already crossing the horizon. The battle was far from over. 4:40 in the morning. Ramstein Air Base. The black smoke from the wreckage of Hangar 3 rose in a jagged, oily column that blotted out the early morning stars. The air around the flight line was a toxic mixture of atomized jet fuel, burnt rubber, and the sharp, metallic tang of vaporized aluminum. Despite the devastation, the base did not waver. The Shield of Germany, the integrated air and missile defense network, was now fully awake and operating at maximum capacity. 12 Russian Kh-101 cruise missiles remained in the air, having bypassed the initial outer-tier defenses, and they were now entering the lethal engagement envelope of the base's inner-tier protection. The tactical heart of this defense was the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, commonly known as NASAMS. Distributed in concealed positions around the 6-mile perimeter of the base, these batteries were linked by high-speed fiber optic cables to the Air Operations Center. Each launcher held 6 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, the same weapons carried by F-35 fighters, but adapted for ground launch. The soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 1st Air Defense Artillery Regiment, sat in their darkened canisters, their eyes tracking the high-speed red dots closing in from the north and northeast. The wall of fire. At 4:42 in the morning, the NASAMS Fire Distribution Center initiated a ripple fire engagement. 3 launchers situated near the village of Spesbach ignited simultaneously. The sound was not a single boom, but a rapid-fire sequence of tearing screeches as 6 missiles left their canisters in less than 10 seconds. The AIM-120 interceptors accelerated to Mach 4 almost instantly, their white exhaust trails carving a chaotic, intersecting pattern against the black sky of the Rhineland Palatate. The sky over the valley was no longer dark. It was a theater of violent light. Each interceptor was searching for the infrared signature of the Russian cruise missiles. At an altitude of only 300 meters, the first intercept occurred. A NASAMS missile punched through the midsection of a cruise missile at coordinates 49 degrees 26 minutes north, 7 degrees 35 minutes east. The resulting detonation was a brilliant pale blue flash that momentarily turned the surrounding pine forests into a stark, overexposed landscape of white and gray. The debris, consisting of shredded titanium and unspent fuel, rained down over the empty fields of the Palatinate forest, the sound of the explosion reaching the base 5 seconds later as a low, rolling thunder. Systematic attrition. Inside the Air Operations Center, the senior air defense officer coordinated the layering of the defense. As the NASAMS batteries engaged the mid-range targets, the Patriot PAC-3 batteries focused on the high-priority threats, aiming for the command bunkers and the primary fuel farm. The integration of these two systems created a killing zone, where any missile entering the airspace was being tracked by at least 3 different radar systems. Track 615 intercepted. Track 618 intercepted. The automated voice of the tactical computer reported. The red icons on the main screen were disappearing one by one. By 4:48 in the morning, 8 of the remaining 12 missiles had been destroyed in flight. The success was a testament to the thousands of hours of training and the technical superiority of the United States hardware. The air smelled of burnt ozone and cold, damp earth, a sensory contradiction of high-technology warfare and the quiet German countryside. However, the saturation of the airspace created its own dangers. The sky was filled with falling iron shrapnel from the intercepted missiles and the spent boosters of the Patriot interceptors. One 500-pound booster casing slammed into a parking lot near the base exchange, crushing 3 civilian vehicles and rupturing a water main. The sound of twisted metal and high-pressure water added to the cacophony of the morning. The final gap. Despite the near-perfect performance of the interceptors, the sheer physics of a saturation strike meant the margin for error was razor-thin. 2 KH-101 missiles had executed a pop-up maneuver, climbing to 1,000 feet, and then diving vertically to gain speed and bypass the horizontal search beams of the perimeter radars. These 2 projectiles were now less than 90 seconds from impact. The defense shifted to its final, most desperate tier, the Close-In Weapon Systems, or CIWS. These radar-guided, 20mm Gatling guns, known to the sailors and airmen as R2D2 due to their dome-like shape, began to swivel toward the north. The sound of their search radars humming to life was a high-pitched whine that cut through the roar of the fires at Hangar 3. The gun crews, sheltered in nearby bunkers, gripped their controls. They were the last line of defense. If they failed, the remaining warheads would strike the base's primary communications hub, potentially blinding the United States response across the entire European continent. The air was still, the wind having died down, leaving the valley filled with the drifting white smoke of dozens of missile trails. The silence of the next few seconds was absolute. A heavy, suffocating stillness that was broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of a secondary explosion within the burning hangar. Everyone at Ramstein was looking up, waiting for the final act of the morning's violence to begin. 4:45 in the morning. The dark, freezing sky 10,000 feet above the Eifel Mountains. 2 F-35 Alpha Lightning fighters from the 493rd Fighter Squadron were pushing their Pratt & Whitney engines to the absolute limit. They were not engaged in a traditional dogfight against another pilot. They were hunting low-flying, stealthy ghosts that were designed to decapitate the American command structure in Europe. The air at this altitude was thin and biting, and the cockpit glass was beginning to frost at the edges, while the world below was a black void punctuated only by the distant, angry orange glow of the fires at Ramstein Air Base. The lead pilot, call sign Cajun, adjusted his helmet-mounted display, which allowed him to see through the floor of his own aircraft using the distributed aperture system. The 2 remaining KH-101 cruise missiles were flying at an altitude of only 35 meters, hugging the contours of the Glan River Valley. To the sophisticated radar of the F-35, these targets appeared as tiny, intermittent flickers against the heavy clutter of the trees and hills. Cajun knew that if they reached the base perimeter, the defensive transition to the short-range guns would be the last, most desperate gamble of the morning. He toggled his master arm switch to the on position, the green light on his console, reflecting in his visor as he prepared to engage the first target. The climax, steel in the sky. The pilot pressed the red trigger on the side stick. The internal weapons bay doors of the F-35 snapped open for a fraction of a second, and a single AIM-9X Sidewinder shrieked into the night. A jagged spear of white-hot magnesium light chased the missile as it cleared. The fuselage, the physical shock of the launch vibrating through the pilot's seat, the smell of burnt cordite and ozone was momentarily sucked into the jet's environmental system, a sharp chemical reminder of the violence just unleashed. The Sidewinder's infrared seeker locked onto the white-hot exhaust of the cruise missile's small turbofan engine with predatory precision. It slammed into the rear fuselage at a speed of Mach 2.5, the blast fragmentation warhead shredding the titanium skin and the internal guidance computer instantly. A massive fireball of high-octane fuel and high-explosive material erupted in the sky, a brilliant orange sphere that bleached the cockpit. of the fighter jet white for 3 full seconds. The pressure wave of the detonation was so intense that it momentarily disrupted the airflow over Cajun's wings, forcing him to fight the controls to maintain his intercept heading. The remains of the Russian missile did not fall silently. The burning wreckage, still propelled by its massive forward momentum, tumbled through the air like a dying comet. It struck a ridgeline 3 miles south of the base, at coordinates 49 degrees, 25 minutes north, 7 degrees, 38 minutes east. The impact triggered a secondary explosion of the unspent warhead that sent a deep, vibrating shockwave through the entire valley, flattening a 50-meter circle of ancient pine trees and sending a shower of earth and fire 200 feet into the air. Black smoke and the flickering orange glow of a new forest fire marked the spot where the threat had ended. High above, the F-35 banked hard to the left in a high G-turn, the pilots breathing heavy and rhythmic inside the oxygen mask. Cajun checked his fuel state and weapon counts. He had 1 missile left, and there was still 1 more Vampire unaccounted for on the data link. The final missile had vanished into the radar shadows of the dense urban area near Kaiserslautern, and time was running out. The last straggler. Inside the Air Operations Center, the mood had shifted from calculated observation to high-stakes desperation. Viper Flight, be advised, Track 619, is back on the scope. The controller's voice crackled over the secure channel. It is heading for the primary communications center, the Big Belly. You are authorized to ignore all noise abatement and altitude restrictions. Stop that missile. The final KH-101 was no longer following the river. It had entered its terminal phase, accelerating to its maximum speed as it calculated the final GPS coordinates of its target. It was flying directly over the rooftops of the base housing area, the roar of its engine shattering windows and terrifying the families huddled in their basements. To intercept it now, Cajun would have to fire his last missile over a populated area, a decision that would be measured in lives regardless of the outcome. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and the distant, acrid smell of the burning hangar, a grim atmosphere for the final seconds of the air intercept. 4:51 in the morning. The command bunker at Ramstein Air Base. The atmosphere inside the Air Operations Center was a pressurized mix of recycled oxygen, stale coffee, and the sharp, metallic scent of static electricity from the server banks. General Marcus Vance, the commander of United States Air Forces in Europe, stood before the tactical map with his hands clenched behind his back. The cold blue light of the digital displays etched deep lines into his face, highlighting the exhaustion of a man who had just watched his primary maintenance hangar vanish in a ball of fire. He knew that the strategic implication of this strike extended far beyond the loss of 2 transport aircraft. It was a direct challenge to the United States' commitment to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The last remaining KH-101 cruise missile was a red pulsing icon on the screen, currently located at coordinates 49 degrees 26 minutes north, 7 degrees 36 minutes east. It was less than 60 seconds from the PA Primary Communications Center, known colloquially as the Big Belly. This hardened facility housed the secure satellite uplinks and the fiber optic terminals that connected the Pentagon to every American unit from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. If this node was severed, the United States European Command would be effectively blinded at the exact moment a coordinated response was required. The strategic wait. General, the F-35 is out of position for a clean shot without risking the housing area, the tactical director reported, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the rhythmic, electronic chirping of the radar sweep. Vance looked at the projected flight path of the missile, which was now skimming the tops of the trees near the base hospital. He had a choice between trusting the automated short-range defenses or risking a friendly missile detonation over the homes of 5,000 American dependents. Hold the F-35, Vance ordered, his voice low and steady. Activate the Phalanx close-in weapon system on the north roof of the communications center. Tell the gun crew to go to manual override. We cannot afford a miss. The command was transmitted instantly through the hardened landlines. On the roof of the massive concrete structure, the white-domed close-in weapon system swiveled with robotic speed, its 20mm six-barrel Gatling gun pointing toward the tree line, where the threat was expected to emerge. The wall of lead. The air around the communications center was heavy with the smell of coal, damp pine needles, and the distant, acrid smoke from the burning ruins of Hangar 3. At 4:52 in the morning, the Russian missile cleared the last row of trees, its small jet engines screaming as it accelerated for the final dive. The phalanx radar locked on instantly, and the system began to fire at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. The sound was not like a machine gun. It was a continuous, mechanical growl that vibrated through the reinforced concrete of the entire building. A stream of armor-piercing tungsten subcaliber rounds tore through the air, creating a visible line of white tracers in the pre-dawn darkness. The cruise missile was struck repeatedly in its nose section, the heavy rounds punching through the guidance sensor and the warhead's firing circuit. The projectile did not explode in the air. Instead, it was literally shredded by the volume of fire. The mangled remains of the missile, now a collection of jagged titanium plates and twisted wires, slammed into the reinforced perimeter wall of the center. The impact was violent, throwing a cloud of concrete dust and sparks 50 feet into the air, but the warhead failed to detonate. Damage assessment. A heavy silence followed the cessation of the Gatling gun's roar. The only sound was the clattering of thousands of spent brass casings as they rolled off the roof and onto the pavement below. The Big Belly remained operational. Its satellite dishes still pointed toward the heavens, unscathed by the final straggler of the first wave. In the bunker, a collective breath was released, but there were no cheers. The status board showed 10 personnel confirmed killed in action from the Hangar 3 strike, and another 24 remained missing in the rubble. General Vance turned away from the screen and looked at his executive officer. "Get me a secure line to the National Military Command Center in Washington. We need to know where those bombers are now." The air in the room felt even colder than before. They had survived the first salvo, but the intelligence reports from United States European Command suggested that a second, larger formation of Russian aircraft was already airborne over the Barents Sea. The base was wounded, its firefighters were exhausted, and the sun was still 2 hours from rising over the German horizon. 5:20 in the morning. The petroleum, oil, and lubricants farm at the eastern edge of Ramstein Air Base. The massive white storage tanks, each holding 1 million gallons of JP-8 jet fuel, were the base's lifeblood and its greatest vulnerability. They were supposed to be protected by the inner tier screen, but a single Russian Kh-101 cruise missile had exploited a temporary radar blind spot, caused by the thick, debris-heavy smoke still pouring from the ruins of Hangar 3. The air near the fuel farm was cold and smelled of damp asphalt and pine, but that was about to change. At coordinates 49 degrees, 27 minutes north, 7 degrees, 36 minutes east, the final threat of the second wave made its terminal move. The Kh-101 cruise missile dropped its altitude to 15 meters, its small turbofan engine howling with a high-pitched, mechanical scream as it cleared the perimeter fence. The missile's internal computer adjusted its guidance fins with microsecond precision, locking the nose sensor onto the sharp thermal contrast of the fuel tanks against the freezing morning ground. It was moving at 880 kilometers per hour, a silver-gray blur that gave the security forces on the ground only 2 seconds to register its presence. The climax: impact at Tank Farm Alpha. The warhead punched through the 4mm steel skin of storage tank Alpha 4 with a violent, metallic crash. The detonation of the 1,000-pound high-explosive charge was instantaneous, occurring inside the pressurized volume of the tank. A pillar of orange fire erupted 600 feet into the air, a roaring wall of heat that reached temperatures of 2,000 degrees in a single heartbeat. The sheer thermal load caused the steel structures of the two neighboring tanks to buckle and warp, the metal groaning and shrieking as it liquefied. A massive shockwave slammed into the nearby administrative buildings, shattering every reinforced window and throwing personnel across rooms with the force of a physical blow. The firefighters of the 86th Civil Engineer Group did not retreat from the inferno. Two P-19 rescue fire trucks roared toward the edge of the secondary containment dike, their roof-mounted monitors spraying a high-pressure stream of aqueous film-forming foam. The men inside the vehicles felt the heat blister the red paint on their trucks, even through their silver heat-reflective suits. The lead fire chief shouted orders over the radio, directing his team to establish a cooling perimeter to prevent the fire from spreading to the main pumping station, which controlled the fuel lines to the entire southern flight line. The morning sky was no longer gray. It was a hellish, bruised purple, choked by a massive cloud of soot that rained oily black droplets over the entire eastern half of the base. The fuel farm, once a sterile grid of white cylinders, was now a landscape of liquid fire and twisted, blackened iron. The loss of Alpha 4 meant that 40% of the base's immediate fuel reserves had been vaporized, leaving the remaining fighters and transport planes with a rapidly dwindling window of operational capacity. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of burning kerosene and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the burning tank's internal supports collapsing into the fire. Inside the Air Operations Center, on the logistics status board, the fuel icon for the base turned from green to a flashing amber. "General, we've lost Alpha 4, the logistics officer reported, his voice hollow. "The pumping station is offline until the fire is contained. We can't refuel the jet fighter aircraft currently in the air. If we don't get a tanker over the base in 20 minutes, they'll have to divert to Spangdahlem or Aviano." General Vance stared at the screen. The Russian strike had been calculated with brutal efficiency. By hitting the maintenance hangars first and the fuel farm second, they were systematically stripping away Ramstein's ability to sustain air operations. The base was still standing, but its teeth were being pulled one by one. The air in the bunker felt heavy, the silence punctuated only by the distant, muffled thud of another explosion from the fuel farm. The time for defense was over. If the United States did not strike back now, there would be nothing left to defend. 5:45 in the morning on the 28th of March, 2026, the White House Situation Room and the flight line at Ellsworth Air Force Base, South Dakota. The President of the United States sat at the head of the mahogany table, his face illuminated by the harsh, blue-white glare of the global digital map. On the primary screen, a live satellite feed from a Keyhole 12 reconnaissance platform showed the skeletal, burning remains of Maintenance Hangar 3 and the massive, oily black plume of smoke rising from the fuel farm at Ramstein. The air in the underground bunker was filtered and cool, carrying the faint, sterile smell of electronics and the heavy weight of a decision that would change the course of the 21st century. The Russian bombers are recovered and currently refueling at Engels 2 Air Base, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs reported, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. Satellite telemetry confirms they are being rearmed with a second salvo of cruise missiles. If we do not neutralize that platform within the next 90 minutes, the third and fourth waves will hit our remaining hubs in the United Kingdom and Italy. The president looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight in Washington, and the sun was already beginning to touch the horizon over the Baltic Sea. "Authorize the launch," he said, the words falling into the room with a heavy, final thud. "Execute Operation Retribution Alpha. I want those bombers destroyed on the ground. Use the long-range stealth assets. No mission creep, no escalation beyond the strike group at Engels. We are restoring the deterrent, not starting a nuclear exchange. The raiders awake." 7,000 miles to the east, the biting wind of the South Dakota prairie whipped across the taxiway at Ellsworth Air Force Base. The air was frigid, smelling of dry grass and the sharp chemical bite of advanced radar-absorbent coatings. Emerging from the massive, climate-controlled hangars were 3 B-21 Raider stealth bombers. These flying wings, the most advanced strike platforms ever built, moved with a ghostly, predatory silence that defied their massive size. Their dark, charcoal gray skin was designed to swallow radar waves, making them nearly invisible to the most sophisticated Russian early warning systems. The crews of the 28th Bomb Wing had been at a state of high readiness for 72 hours. As the pilots climbed the narrow ladders into the pressurized cockpits, the smell of recycled oxygen and the faint hum of the flight computers greeted them. Each B-21 Raider was loaded with 16 AGM-158 Bravo joint air-to-surface standoff missiles. These weapons were designed to fly 1,000 kilometers through contested airspace and strike with an accuracy of less than 3 meters. At 5:58 in the morning, the lead aircraft, call sign Shadow 11, received the encrypted execution order via the Advanced Battle Management System. The two Pratt & Whitney engines, buried deep within the airframe, hummed to life, producing a low-frequency vibration that could be felt in the chests of the ground crews but barely heard a mile away. The Raiders did not use afterburners. They relied on their aerodynamic efficiency and stealth to penetrate deep into enemy territory. The long reach. The flight path was a masterpiece of strategic planning. Designed to bypass the dense radar networks of the Russian Northern Fleet, the bombers would climb to 50,000 feet, crossing the Atlantic at high subsonic speeds, while receiving fuel from KC-46 Pegasus tankers orbiting in the dark over the mid-Atlantic. The coordinates for the target were locked into the mission computers: 51 degrees 28 minutes north, 46 degrees 12 minutes east. Shadow 11 is airborne, the lead pilot reported over the secure satellite link. The three bombers vanished into the overcast South Dakota sky, leaving no visible contrails. They were moving at 950 kilometers per hour, heading toward the Arctic Circle before banking south toward the Russian heartland. In the Situation Room, the digital icons for the three bombers moved slowly across the globe. For the staff at Ramstein, still fighting fires and treating the wounded, the news of the launch provided a grim sense of purpose. The United States was no longer merely absorbing blows, it was reaching out across the world with a silent, invisible fist. The air in the South Dakota hangars remained cold and still, the scent of jet fuel lingering as the ground crews watched the empty sky, waiting for the return of the aircraft that carried the weight of the nation's response. 6:15 in the morning on the 28th of March, 2026. The Medical Triage Center at Ramstein Air Base. The facility was operating at 4 times its intended capacity as the first wave of casualties from the Hangar 3 strike arrived. The floor of the emergency intake was slick with a mixture of melted snow, mud, and blood, and the air smelled of sharp antiseptic, wet wool, and the lingering, acrid smoke from the flight line. The 86th Medical Group had activated its mass casualty protocol. Within minutes of the first impact, surgeons and medics, many still wearing their chemical warfare overgarments, worked under the flickering glow of emergency battery-powered lights. They were fighting the clock to stabilize the wounded during the critical golden hour, while the distant, muffled thuds of secondary explosions from the fuel farm vibrated through the reinforced concrete walls. The casualty count was specific and heavy. 14 United States Air Force personnel were confirmed killed in action, most of them maintenance specialists who had been caught in the initial blast inside the hangar. Another 52 personnel had sustained significant injuries, ranging from third-degree thermal burns to complex shrapnel wounds and blast-induced lung trauma. Despite the chaos, the medical teams moved with a disciplined, rhythmic efficiency. They had already exhausted 250 liters of whole blood and were now pulling from the emergency reserves flown in from Landstuhl Regional Medical Center by armored convoy just 20 minutes prior. The logistical counter-push. Outside the medical center, the 700th Civil Engineer Squadron was engaged in a different kind of battle. Their mission was to keep the primary runway operational at all costs. The strike on the maintenance hangar had scattered thousands of pieces of foreign object debris, including jagged shards of titanium and pulverized concrete across the main taxiways. If even a single piece of this debris was sucked into a jet engine, it would destroy a $50 million fighter. 3 M1083 tactical trucks, equipped with high-powered magnetic sweeps and heavy-duty blowers, moved in a staggered line down the 2-mile stretch of asphalt, their yellow strobe lights cutting through the thick, oily fog. The logistical challenge was immense. The loss of storage tank Alpha 4 had cut the base's immediately available JP-8 fuel supply by 400,000 gallons. To compensate, the base commander authorized the emergency cross-leveling of fuel from the secondary strategic reserve located 5 miles underground. Engineering teams worked in the freezing mud to lay 3 kilometers of temporary high-pressure hose, bypassing the damaged pumping stations. The air around the repair crews was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and the metallic tang of cold iron. They were working under the constant threat of a third wave of missiles, but no one slowed down, restoring the hub. By 6:45 in the morning, the engineering team had achieved a miracle of military logistics. They had cleared a 1,000-meter hot strip on the northern runway, allowing for the limited recovery of combat aircraft. A C-17 Globemaster transport plane, carrying emergency repair parts and additional air defense interceptors, was cleared for a combat landing. It descended through the black smoke of the burning fuel farm, its landing lights casting long, eerie beams through the soot-choked air. The tires screeched onto the cleared pavement, a triumphant sound that signaled the base was still breathing. Inside the Air Operations Center, the status board for the runway flickered from red to amber, and then finally to green. "The strip is open," the logistics officer announced, his voice hoarse from shouting. The United States' presence in Germany had been bloodied, and the cost in lives was a heavy weight on the command staff. But the base had not been paralyzed. The medical corps continued their grim work in the bunkers. While the process, engineers prepared the ground for the arrival of the retaliatory strike force. The sun was finally beginning to rise, revealing a landscape of fire and wreckage, but the American flag still flew over the control tower, tattered but defiant in the freezing Rhineland wind. 7:15 in the morning, on the 28th of March, 2026. Ingalls II Air Base, Saratov Oblast, Russia. The Russian strategic bomber hub, located 800 kilometers southeast of Moscow, was a hive of frantic activity. 4. Tupolev, 160 Blackjack bombers, their white anti-flash paint gleaming in the weak morning sun, were being refueled by ground crews following their mission over the Norwegian Sea. The air at the base was freezing, smelling of heavy diesel exhaust, high-octane kerosene, and the damp, metallic scent of the Volga River. Russian ground technicians worked in the shadows of the massive swing-wing aircraft, loading fresh Kh-101 cruise missiles into the internal rotary launchers. They believed they were safe within the heart of their own integrated air defense network. They were wrong. High above the cloud layer, 3 B-21 Raider stealth bombers from the 28th Bomb Wing had already reached their launch point. At coordinates 51 degrees north, 46 degrees east, the Raiders had bypassed the outer Russian radar screens by flying a complex route through the gaps in the S-400 surface-to-air missile coverage. The flight lead, call sign Shadow 11, confirmed the targeting data provided by a United States satellite of the National Reconnaissance Office. The mission was simple: eliminate the platform that had struck Ramstein. The climax: retribution at Engels. The trigger was squeezed in the pressurized cockpit of the lead Raider. The internal weapons bay doors snapped open, and a ripple-fire salvo of 32 AGM-158 Bravo stealth cruise missiles fell into the thin, cold air. The missiles' small turbofan engines ignited with a high-pitched, mechanical shriek, leaving thin white trails as they accelerated toward the airfield. The physical shock of the release was felt by the pilots as a slight upward surge of the aircraft. The cockpit smelled of filtered oxygen and the faint, electrical scent of the targeting computers processing the final flight paths. The first wave of missiles arrived at Engels 2 with surgical precision. One AGM-158 Bravo punched clean through the pressurized fuel line, connecting a refueling truck to the lead Tupolev 160. The 1,000-pound warhead detonated inside the aircraft's centerline fuel tank, vaporizing the bomber in a single, massive orange fireball that rose 200 feet into the air. The explosion shredded the 5-ton aluminum wings and sent jagged shards of white-hot titanium flying across the taxiway. The heat blast was so intense, it instantly ignited 2 other bombers parked 50 meters away, turning the flight line into a roaring tunnel of flame and black smoke. The Russian defenders reacted in a state of total shock. The crews of the nearby S-400 missile batteries scrambled to their launchers, but the stealthy profile of the incoming American missiles gave them less than 10 seconds of warning. 2 interceptors were fired into the chaotic sky, but they chased decoys while the remaining American cruise missiles slammed into the base's primary ammunition bunkers. The secondary detonations were catastrophic, a series of rhythmic, ground-shaking explosions that threw armored vehicles off their tracks and collapsed the roof of the main maintenance hangar. Personnel on the ground were seen running into the freezing mist, their voices lost in the roar of the inferno. Black, oily smoke from the burning Blackjack bombers surged upward, drifting across the Volga River and blotting out the morning sun. The silence that followed the final impact was filled only by the crackle of burning jet fuel and the distant, rhythmic wail of Russian emergency sirens. The bombers that had struck Ramstein were no longer a threat. They were a collection of molten scrap and scorched earth. The clean egress. 6 miles above the carnage, the 3 B-21 Raiders banked into a steep, high G-turn to the west. Their mission was complete, and their sensors showed no active radar locks from the remaining Russian batteries. Shadow 1-1 to Global Strike Command. All targets neutralized, the pilot reported, his voice steady. Returning to the barn, the bombers vanished back into the gray overcast, their stealth coatings absorbing the desperate search beams of the Russian radar stations. Back at Ramstein, the news of the successful strike reached the Air Operations Center within minutes. For the airmen still pulling their comrades from the wreckage of Hangar 3, it was the first sign that the balance of power had been restored. The United States had proven it could reach any target, anywhere, with total invisibility. The air in the Russian valley remained thick with the smell of burning kerosene and the heavy, bitter taste of a catastrophic defeat. 12 noon on the 28th of March, 2026. Ramstein Air Base, Germany. The sun sat high over the Rhineland Palatinate, but its light struggled to penetrate the thick, stagnant haze of gray smoke and chemical mist that still hung over the flight line. The giant voice mass notification system had finally fallen silent, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical growl of heavy earth-moving equipment and the distant, high-pitched whine of jet engines. The air smelled of cold, damp earth, burnt polymer, and the lingering, oily scent of the 400,000 gallons of jet fuel that had been vaporized in the strike on Tank Farm Alpha. Everywhere, the surface of the base was covered in a fine layer of black soot, a grim silt that crunched under the boots of the damage assessment teams as they moved through the wreckage, standing near the twisted, blackened skeleton of Maintenance Hangar 3. General Marcus Vance surveyed the physical cost of the morning's engagement. The loss was calculated with a professional, heavy-hearted precision. 14 United States Air Force personnel had been confirmed killed in action, their names already being processed for the notification of next of kin. 52 airmen and soldiers remained in the medical system, with 12 in critical condition. At Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, 2 Cone 130J Super Hercules transport aircraft were total losses, and the primary maintenance hub for the 86th Airlift Wing was now a graveyard of scorched steel and melted aluminum. Despite the local devastation, the mission assessment provided to the National Military Command Center was one of hard-won success. The integrated air and missile defense system had intercepted 14 of the 16 incoming Russian cruise missiles, a 90% success rate, against one of the most sophisticated low-observable weapons in the world. The primary communications center remained untouched, and the air bridge between the United States and its European allies had been closed for less than 4 hours. The base was wounded, but its heart was still beating, its satellite dishes still tilted toward the sky to coordinate the global American response. The effectiveness of the retaliation was even more decisive. Satellite reconnaissance from the National Reconnaissance Office confirmed the total destruction of the bomber group at Engels 2. 4 Tupolev 160 Blackjack bombers had been reduced to smoldering craters, along with the base's primary cruise missile storage facility. The B-21 Raider strike had sent a clear, undeniable message to the Kremlin. The United States possessed the capability to strike the source of any aggression with total invisibility and absolute lethality. The Russian strategic bomber fleet in the Western District had been neutralized in a single 30-minute engagement. The restoration of resolve. On the northern runway, the first C-5M Super Galaxy transport plane of the afternoon was already on its final approach. It carried a specialized rapid engineer deployable heavy operational repair squadron engineer team known as Red Horse, along with 200 tons of high-strength concrete and replacement radar components. The sound of its massive turbofan engines was a deep, vibrating roar that seemed to push back the silence of the morning's tragedy. As the aircraft touched down, the ground crews at Ramstein began the transition from survival to reconstruction, their movements fast and purposeful in the cold German air. General Vance watched as a group of airmen worked to clear the last of the debris from the taxiway near the control tower. Among the shattered glass and twisted metal, the base's primary flagstaff still stood. A new, clean American flag was being hoisted to the top, its red and white stripes cutting through the gray smog of the valley. The air was thin and freezing, but it no longer tasted of defeat. The strike on Ramstein had been intended to shatter the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the base was more integrated, more defended, and more determined than it had been at 3 in the morning. The final report was typed into the secure terminal at 1300 hours. It noted the severe damage and the tragic loss of life. But its conclusion was a statement of strategic reality. Ramstein Air Base remained the essential hub of American power in the Eastern Hemisphere. The logistics lines were open, the fighters were refueled, and the defensive shield had been reinforced with additional Patriot batteries arriving from Naval Station Rota. The cost had been heavy, written in the lives of 14 professionals, but the objective had been achieved. The breach had been closed, and the world now knew that the American shield would not break under the weight of fire.